The people of St. Mark's Cathedral acknowledge that we gather on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle who are still here, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of the Duwamish tribe. We want to say thanks to all who have made a contribution, a donation to St. Mark's Cathedral in support of this film series. And with that, I'm going to turn the evening over to David Wild. David has been a member of our team for a couple of years and a wonderful part of it. And he's going to, so David, would you please take it away?
Yeah. Well, we're really fortunate to have two great guests tonight. Molly Stewart, who directed the film Objector, which you've just seen, and Asaf Aran, who's from Seattle, and he's connected with some of the people we all know here. And he did serve. Well, I'll read his bio in a little bit, but he is a refuser. So, Richard, is there anything that you need to say as far as the chat before we get going? Or I know we're leaving everybody's mics on, but please mute yourself. Just so we don't hear chewing sounds or rustling papers or that kind of thing. And then anything else, Richard?
No, I just to reiterate what you said, unlike last time when I had to ask people to unmute themselves, and then when they muted themselves, I had to ask them to unmute themselves again. This time we're just allowing people to mute and unmute themselves on their own accord, and we reserve on the honor system. So when it's time for you to speak, unmute yourself, and when you're done, please mute yourself. And we reserve the right to mute anyone or kick anyone out if there's any troublemakers, but I don't see any troublemakers. So we have a, once we get to the question and answer portion, you can either raise your virtual hand using the reactions, or you can also type your question in the chat. Just click on chat and you'll see that you can ask a question. And we'll try to call on people in the order that they either raise their hand or type in the chat, but we don't always get that quite right. So I'll hand it back to David now.
Great. Well, I'd like to introduce Molly. Molly Stewart's a director. Molly was a 2018 Women, Peace, and Security Fellow and a 2019 resident with SF Film. While earning an MFA in cinema at San Francisco State University, Molly won the Bill Nichols Excellent in Cinema Award, the Canon Best in Show Award, the Spotlight on Women in Film Award, and the Barbara Hammer Award. She has also won several film festival awards, including Best Documentary Short, Best Young Woman Storyteller Award. But what I think is pretty amazing is that Objector is her first feature film. And that's a really big deal because it's a really good film. And to have that be your first film as a director is pretty great. So Molly, if you could talk for a little bit, and then I'll introduce Asaf, and then we'll be able to start a conversation.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for viewing the film and hosting me. I guess I'll start with the most common question that people ask, which is, how did I get into this and how did I get connected to Atelier? So I actually went to college in Vermont with Amitai, who's Atelier's brother, who you saw in the film. And that was back in, while we were in college, the 2014 bombings of Gaza were happening. And I saw that effect from afar, and also the effect up close on some Palestinian friends that I had made in college. And so I decided to go with Amitai to learn more about the conflict and also participate in solidarity efforts in Palestine in the South Hebron Hills, which you also see featured in the film. And so I, at that point in 2014, I met with Osama, who's also in the film, and many other activists, both Israeli and Palestinian. And I also met Atelier just through Amitai, who hosted me there. And at the time, she was planning to be a combat soldier. She was still in high school, early in high school. And I connected with her and, asked her a lot about her plans, and was struck by, what a thoughtful person she was, even though at the time she was still planning to join the military and kind of follow what she thought was kind of the route to be a moral soldier. And then we stayed in touch over the years, and I saw how she got to know more Palestinians and see things from outside of the narrative that she was passed down through school and through so many avenues, just being an Israeli. And so when I started to see this transformation, I asked her if she would want to make a film about this decision, and it was just going to be a short film. I went and filmed her 6 months before her decision, and then again close to her enlistment date. And with that, I made a short film that ended up being kind of what I was able to use to get some grant money to actually make the longer film. And it wasn't until after she had gone to prison and I was able to go back and film a few more times with her and her family that I started to develop more of the personal narrative and the family narrative that became really, I think, crucial to the story. So that's a bit about the process. Looking forward to answering any questions you have, and I know that you all are already very familiar with the struggle for Palestinian human rights and for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So I look forward to hearing your perspectives as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how to hear how the film progressed, because obviously, with the documentary, you're starting off with one thing in mind, but I think you have to be open-minded enough to see which way that can flow. I mean, that's something we can talk about. I also think there's kind of an interesting perspective when, just because the fact that there's a camera in the room, people behave differently. And I think it'd be interesting to see how that affected Atalia too. And her brother is obviously a pretty impressive guy, and I imagine was a big influence with her as well. Well, let me introduce Asaf. Asaf Aran is a statistician working in health research. He moved with his family from Israel to Seattle in fall 2002 for PhD studies and to take a partial break from a nation obsessed with subjugating another nation. Sadly, his nation has taken no break during the intervening 20 years, but rather doubles down on its obsession. In 1985 to 88, Asaf served as a combat infantry soldier in Israel's military, learning how to enforce said subjugation in the West Bank, Gaza, southern Lebanon. He was part of the active infantry reserve until leaving Israel in 2002. Asaf had worked in the Israeli high-tech industry as an engineer and an algorithm dude. He provided this bio. In the 1990s, Asaf volunteered for a while at the Hotline, a Jerusalem-based human rights assistance center to occupied Palestinians. In fall 2000, when violence erupted and he watched in live broadcast the prime minister he had campaigned for, falsely declaring that, quote, there is no partner for peace, unquote, Asaf decided to refuse to serve the occupation regime any longer, should he be called up to do so. In January 2002, he joined the Reservist Public Refusal Pledge, later known as Courage to Refuse, which reached over 5,000 signatories. In 2000 to 2002, Asaf was also involved in the activities of Tayush and the Villages Group, continuing to raise funds and awareness for them after moving to Seattle. Hello, Asaf.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. And congratulations, Molly, on the film again, and an excellent film. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad you could be here for the conversation.
Yeah, just a small correction. It wasn't 5,000 signatories, more than 500. I think they reached close to 700 by the time we
it was
lost
500. Yeah.
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 By the time we lost our 15 minutes of attention, it was close to 700, I think.
That's great. So can you talk a little bit about, or could you tell us a little bit about when you watched the film, what was going through your mind? Because I think that obviously you went through some of the similar kind of decisions, and you also, I know that you're very familiar with the areas that are in the film, but if you could tell us a little bit about that, because I imagine you share.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you. So before coming here in 2002, I spent most of my life in Israel before that. And I felt very close in the film for several reasons. First of all, I'm also from Jerusalem. At least I spent, that's my hometown, one could say. And Atalia is about the age of my oldest sons, who came of age here and therefore did not have to face the same dilemmas she did, but are involved in peace and justice activities regarding Palestine. In fact, my middle son was just last night in activity in front of ADL headquarters here in Seattle. And also because of the background, refusal at age 18 is a very, very hard thing to do. The entire Israeli system is designed to really funnel and brainwash kids into joining enthusiastically, as Molly has testified meeting Atalia a few years earlier when she was 15 or so, and or 16 even. So it's many of the 18-year-old refusers are born into the movement, if you will. Like their parents and grandparents are already quote unquote radicals. They're already active against the occupation, are already out there, outspoken. Like Tair Kaminer, who features in the movies, she's a few years older and she spent time in jail, and she's among the organizers of Mesarvot. She's her grandpa. Both her parents and her grandpa are all have been in the anti-occupation movement, but Atalia grew up in this more mainstream family of people who might be liberal and progressive on many things, but are certainly in the mainstream and see serving in the military as a very high positive value, or at least as a thing to do. And she had apparently her grandpa, as Fayaz Sood, was actually a pretty influential right-wing organizer. Some Google closer to mine in terms of I also might have been liberal, progressive, but certainly in the mainstream, and I was kind of have to grapple with that. I think more generally, the film is what's really struck me about it is how it found the golden path between the personal and the public. That is, we don't lose complete view of the general injustice or the regime, the issue of the occupation being a regime that oppresses people and deprives them of their rights. But we don't go totally into political, deep political analysis or blood and gore, which is easy to provide for sure in this story. But on the other hand, we don't veer also too closely to just making it a personal story about, one young woman who happens to be very special, and she is very special, and it kind of passes this kind of low-key, almost understated, and still bringing out a very strong story this way. And also because of the trust between the director and the family, we're able to see the dynamics, pretty intimate, the dynamics of communication and influence between the family. I'm sure that not every moment is 100% spontaneous, but there's a lot of spontaneous moments and a lot of very earnest conversations, and you can see how there's a trust and love and respect between the parents and the children, and it ends up that the child educates the parents in this case, and they follow along and become kind of open their eyes to the occupation and then ended up embracing her decision and her commitment that they did not originally. And about Atalia herself, it's really very impressive how she can contain all these conflicts and still, stand her ground, but do it very gently and maintain that love and respect. And I have to say myself that I've burnt many bridges sometimes in my family because I'm not made of that kind of material. And also how she steps out there to the West Bank and tries to become a true ally to Palestinians, which again, at such an early age, it's really impressive to do. And maybe it's better done early, I think, before you're corrupted, I don't know, or whatever, by more pragmatic considerations.
So Molly, how is Atalia doing these days?
She's doing well. She, after she got out of prison, she did several years of civil service, working, volunteering in basically a shelter for homeless youth. And she really loved that work, even though it was quite taxing and hard. And then she enrolled in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and is studying sociology and anthropology and philosophy. So she's still doing that now.
Was there any further fallout from the decisions she made?
It certainly limits the career path she can have in Israel, but I think the limits would also be self-imposed most of the time. She's interested in finding a work that serves social justice at large. So, she was able to work in this homeless shelter, for instance, without them basically discriminating against her based on her decision and her past. But many other jobs would do that. It's very common for the first question in a job interview to be, what was your role in the military? So
really, huh?
Yeah. So that's one piece of fallout. She certainly has developed as a spokesperson and continued organizing with other objectors. And every year there's an effort to put out another one of these letters where youth commit to not go to the military. Not all of them end up going to jail and becoming spokespeople for the movement, but they commit to finding their way out one way or another. And so that's something she continues to be involved in as well.
Yeah, I wondered, are there more, just statistically, are there more and more refusers each year? Is this growing?
No, sadly it's not.
Really?
Yeah, it's an uphill battle. As
do you
many
think
of you
that's
might
because
imagine.
of the early sort of inoculations?
Yeah, maybe Asaf can speak to this.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think, and we, so the Courage to Refuse initiative, which took place exactly 20 years ago in early 2002, tried to hit it. It wasn't the first one, but tried really to get in the numbers. And we got into the numbers very, very quickly. And even that wasn't enough. So the initiative started January 2002. And in late March of that year, if you remember, the military, following a terrible terror attack at the eve of Passover of that year, that was the final pretext for really launching a wide-scale attacks, which really dismantled, essentially turned whatever there was in the Palestinian Authority or autonomy into a hollow shell, which continues to be a hollow shell. And at that time, again, there were already hundreds of reservist refusers signed up on that, and they stepped up. And so many were called up. I was not called up, but many were called up, and all of them refused, and many of them went into jail. So like easily 50, 60 outright refusers in the military prisons at once, a record amount for sure for Israel, and that wasn't anywhere near to stop anything. But what I want to say is, over the years, there's always been a hope that the refusers will become a snowball, and it will increase and do the job for us, if you will, and end the occupation. And it's not. It hasn't happened. It's true that if you're going to have 50,000 people walking off, it will end the occupation. But it's not very unlikely to happen for many reasons, and we have to know. I just want to say up front. I know it's a preaching to the choir, but I mean, Atalia did the right thing. It doesn't mean we can judge all the other 18-year-olds who go, again, because of that system that pretty much brainwashes them into going and leaves them with little choice also. But I mean, the what she's been trying to fight against or struggle against is a dictatorship. Okay, the occupation is a regime. We have to understand that. It's first and foremost a regime. It's a dictatorship designed along racist lines, not in the way of biological race, but in the way of privileging Israeli Jews over the Palestinian occupied Palestinians and depriving them from all rights. And it is based on corruption, also on corrupting all sides, and it corrupts all sides. So it is an imperative to dismantle it. But we shouldn't expect the foot soldiers of the occupation to be the ones doing that. That's maybe the least likely path of all. So it's up to us to find a way to do it. Of course, a non-violent way, I should emphasize. But there are many, as we are seeing now, also with Ukraine, there's many non-violent options to help at least exact the price from a regime. So about the refusers and numbers, it hasn't been increasing, and the military has been pretty good in containing. And again, when we came out, we were reservists, and we were from the middle of society. Many of us, I mean, and we were already, working, and many people were upper middle class, connected in society. And the first response of the media and the military was to incite against us, and that backfired. We went from 50 on the first day to 100 the next week to 200 2 weeks later, and then they turned into containment, and the containment worked, because after all, I mean, let's not forget that at least a majority of Israelis now are right wing, so they're not going to refuse for that, and then that leaves among all the rest. It's a pretty radical step to decide to refuse. So you're never going to reach the numbers once they don't directly try to martyr you and ostracize you in a way that backfires. They have so many means at their disposal to do that. I mean, they were like quietly letting people off, just releasing them from the ranks of reservists, and then they're not refusers anymore. They did that in the years after 2002, so I've heard. And with the 18-year-olds, again, it's a game. At the same time that we refused, there were 6. There was another letter, just like the letter that Atalia signed. There was a letter in 2001, 2002, and a lot of kids signed it. And 6 of them actually were court-martialed and ended up spending about 2 years in civilian jail in between like 2002 to 2004-05. So they paid a huge price. But they were ostracized. It wasn't it. So that in that case, it was definitely a deterrent. Like, okay, the next 17 or 18-year-old who comes up, okay, am I willing to spend 2 years now in jail? So they pick and choose their means, And then there's also the overall external environment. And we have to understand Israel. I mean, one of the biggest fallacies that Israel also tells the world, and the world they think it's an internal Israeli affair. It is not. It is an international affair. It is one nation oppressing the other and really depriving it of life, but in any meaningful way, and doing it outside its legal borders as well. What I want to say about that.
Yeah, I would add that it's an international affair in the sense that the U.S. is so complicit in funding
Exactly.
the Israeli military
Yes.
and the occupation in so many ways. So,
and you can see how and Israel is a society and now more than ever and increasingly so, very embedded in the world, very opened up, especially to the West, not only but especially to the West, and extremely sensitive and attuned to what's going on in the West. And the last few years, Trump was in power, and he told Israel, do whatever you want, and the Palestinians, as far as I'm concerned, can go kill themselves. They don't exist. And that emboldens the right, that emboldens the government, and that disincentives young people who might have second thoughts about going. Atalia did her refusal right at the start of the Trump years. After 3 years of Trump years, I mean, it's not even a thing anymore to talk about the occupation in Israel. It's supposedly not there anymore because Trump ended it, right? Trump said, you can have peace and normalization with whatever you want, and you can have anything you want, and the Palestinians don't factor anymore, and that becomes the new normal, and in a way a wet dream for many Israelis, for sure for many Israeli political entities. So against that background, to go and make a stand of refusal it's just a matter of threshold, and then the threshold moves farther and farther out. So you're gonna have fewer and fewer people willing to do it because what for? It's like useless right now.
I wondered, Molly, with the parents, how they changed, and we saw them change. Because I understand it's an uphill battle for sure, but it seems like if the older generation can kind of get swayed, if people can learn from their children in a little bit, that can be or learn a little bit from their children and a lot from their children, it can make a huge effect. Have they gotten more involved since this film?
yeah, they have. I think they continued their trajectory, particularly Alona, the mother. And I also will say what was not shown in the film because it happened maybe about a year later, but there's a brief scene in the film with Atalia's cousins where one of them is saying that she's about to join the military, or maybe she just joined, and she was becoming a spokesperson for the military, and she was trying to justify that to Atalia, and so what happened with her is what I witnessed in that dinner was just immense confusion and internal conflict, but a real commitment, whether out of fear or indoctrination, to just to justify her position, because of course, as Asaf is saying, this is really the only narrative that most Israeli youth are exposed to. But because of her relationship with Atalia, and and her own witnessing of the lies that she was, and the propaganda that she was supposed to be given as a spokesperson in training, she ended up gray refusing. So she left the military, did not go to prison, did not become a spokesperson, but she did essentially opt out. She got an exemption to not continue service. And I think that there are many people who do that, and it's not, there's not good data about why and how many are doing it for some sort of hidden political reason, versus, you know, whatever stated reason that they got the exemption for. But I would agree with SF that it's not, the numbers are not rising nearly as much as we would need to see for it to have the kind of impact that it may have had, you know, during the Lebanon War and much more, which is what's needed now. But but it is still important that there is now this group that is organizing young people and little by little trying to create a counter narrative and create a support network for people to make the decision, not just on their own, but with a social group to support them. And that's what Messer Vote is doing. And that's what the Refuser Solidarity Network is trying to garner international support for.
I just have a couple more questions before we open it up. Has the grandfather seen the film, and what did he think? Does he still think she's stupid?
I think he still thinks her choice was stupid. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I kind of figured that.
Yes. But, yeah.
And then my question that I always have every time we screen one of these films, and I'd like to ask you both, is what can we do here in Seattle? You know, we're a long ways away. What can we do?
I think the rest of the world needs to hold Israel accountable. I think the main reason that the occupation continues is because it's so convenient for Israelis. I mean, Israelis are driven mostly by people in general. You know, we all how is it? We're not very different from other organisms. We go towards comfort and away from fear and pain, right? And likewise with Israelis, the reality without occupation is unfamiliar, is not even living memory for most Israelis, for sure, and not at all. And it's very scary, that kind of reality. The current situation is comfortable enough, and they're also afraid of, again, there's this peer pressure, huge social pressure. So you're afraid to speak out. I feel that fear. You know, I pick and choose my battle with my family. I don't stand up and make statements, or I don't boycott going back to visit my family in Israel, or, you know, I don't, you know, so it's stepping out of line is also held by fear, mostly social fear. So the pragmatic trade-off or balance needs to be changed, and it has to be changed from the outside. Israel has proven beyond any reasonable doubt it cannot end it on its own. It will end it only under external pressure. That might become either by the Palestinians finding some magic combination of effective uprising, or by external pressure by Israel's allies, and the civil society of those allies. There's no other way. And Palestinians have tried long enough, and Israel has specialized, again, in those 50-something years, and before that, even since 48, in many ways, it's specialized in oppressing Palestinians, in undermining civil leadership there, the people who could organize this kind of stuff, in dividing and ruling and corrupting and weakening. So the expectation, again, that Palestinians will do the job for us is, again, not a very likely one. It's really the support network of Israel in the West that needs to step up and do its part. And there's so many things one can do non-violently, completely fairly, and wisely as well. I mean, again, you have to find the stuff that's effective, not the stuff that looks great. So I mean, it's like, I give you an example here in Washington. There were a couple of attempts to have local food stores boycott all Israeli goods, and those have usually failed. But I mean, is it so hard to have them boycott settlements? I mean, settlements are illegal according to American law as well. And that will be a much harder thing to grapple, but the public impact would be the same. So you have to find the way that you can win on whatever turf it is, and putting the occupation on its back heels, and finding the ways, not because finding the ways that are most effective. And again, I'm not an expert in organizing on what would be the right step. And you are, I mean, there's much bigger organizers here in the crowd than me. It's just knowing and keeping increasing the pressure on holding Israel accountable, and having it pay a price for the occupation, a civil price, and that I think is the most likely path.
Molly, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I really agree. In terms of finding the strategic interventions locally, I think it's important to support politicians in the U.S. that will take a stand. And, you know, anyone who does that, even to a minimal degree, faces incredible backlash from the right wing in the U.S. And you know, sometimes massive amounts of campaign contributions to opponents of anyone who will take a stand for Palestinian human rights can really sway an election. And we do really need to change the consensus in Washington in order to change what's happening in Israel. So that's one thing. I would also say direct support for the Refuser Solidarity Network, which supports objectors going through imprisonment, and also the education and organizing that happens to support more people doing that, which I see Rupa has put in the chat already, where you can do that. You can also find other organizations that we have partnered with the filmmaking crew on the website, on the impact page, which I can put in the chat as well. And any of those are very worthy to support. But yeah, local organizing in the U.S. is very important, and it's already great that this group has dedicated itself to that.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, there's a link in the chat to refuser.org. Dave's got his hand up. Dave, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, thank you. Along the same lines of what can we do, which is a question we seem to always ask over the months every spring that we do this. And I wanted to ask Asaf, I think there was, did you mention the action at the ADL headquarters in Seattle? I didn't catch what that was.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So that's another example. And it's, again, it's really disheartening to see how in this century, Israel has aligned itself more and more with the global right. I mean, most of you here are old enough to remember that wasn't the case in recent history. And that is part, again, of not being accountable, not having to pay any price. So they find it comfortable to do that. And one of the ways in this has happened is ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which has it's still considered a venerable, and it's still considered an authority on what constitutes racism, and it conducts education seminars, and in many ways it is an authority on everything except Israel-Palestine, where it has not even a blind spot, but a terrible blemish on its otherwise venerable record. And one thing that ADL does is, I don't know if it's the exact title, but they have a collaboration with police departments, and they send them to Israel to learn training. That's what a supposedly anti-racist organization does. And they've been doing that with impunity for years. Again, I'm sure at least since the start of this century. And when the whole thing came to a head is, once Black Lives Matters came out, and, the horrors of police militarization and racism in the US came out, and suddenly it became, not a great political stance to take, but still they were not held accountable. Now, young organizations, and I'm saying one thing that does encourage me is, so I've been, it's a few years since I've been in a panel or talk like this, but usually I'm by far one of the youngest faces in the crowd. And what's really exciting me is to see finally that has changed in the last 5-10 years. You see a whole cohort of really young people coming in and also very naturally organizing across nationality and ethnic line and backgrounds and whatnot. So a few groups, both Jewish and Palestinian and others, have organized this initiative of holding ADL accountable, and whether or not ADL wants
Including
to stop.
Ta'ayush. Is Ta'ayush one of them?
No, Ta'ayush is a local organization in Israel, Palestine.
Okay.
Here, the Jewish organization is JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an American organization who is doesn't mince words around the occupation and anti-racism, doesn't use euphemism or tiptoe around the topic, puts it straight up. Equality is equality, justice is justice. And then on the Palestinian side, I think there's Palestiniyat, if I'm right, and Students for Justice in Palestine. That's kind of campus-wide network in various campuses. So they're pressuring the cities to stop this, right? Okay, what the heck are you doing? Going to learn how to enforce a dictatorship from people or whatever. So they're pressing both sides, and there was an article in The Guardian a few days ago with leaks. They managed to get a leak from inside ADL and saying that this is creating discord inside ADL. They're having second thoughts already about this whole affair. So that's an example for how you can start holding accountable, not just Israel itself, but the various support mechanisms for that regime that were built in the West, particularly in the US.
Yeah, thank you. And David, if I could hang on to the mic a little bit. And,
yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Art. Just, what can we do? That question. And Asaf, thank you. I've taken some notes, and I've seen some of Palestinian's materials. But what can we do? Molly, your film was so impactful for me. The artistry in it, the imaging, the emotions that accompany the message, that it's because of how you make film. And I think, David, you're a filmmaker too, and you probably see this. My brother is in a very large community of conscientious objectors, and he tries to make films, and he lived in Jerusalem and was exposed to the occupation, and now he's nowhere near able to make what you did. So Molly, it's incredible. He commented, he got a chance to view it. He commented how amazing it was with lighting and the way it was set up, and the sound. So I guess what I'm saying is, what can we do? Encourage you, Molly, to make more of these, because this is pretty extreme high art that tugs on emotions and in that way brings the message. And if I could make a couple of examples, I mean, it struck me early on at 2 minutes and 5 seconds, and it might be Andres Gallegos, when he has the camera at about the 2 or 3 foot level and looking at the mom in bed. It's kind of after the introduction, she's laying in bed reading. And it surprised me to see Talia like emerge from her like a birth, like as a teenager, a birth. And, it's kind of like birth of conscience, birth of consciousness, conscience. And even the metaphor that follows right away is, what are you reading? The subject is war and peace. But Mom, wasn't the subject trashy fiction before? The propaganda, trashy fiction. Well, I read other things too. And and then to have Alona say a little bit after, to say, our mission as Israelis is to grow our faith and to keep it safe. And as she says it, your juxtaposition is this amazing close-up of a young woman on the ground learning how to aim her Uzi or whatever that, you can see that, you can smell the metal in the gun that this young woman is holding. So to keep our faith safe is like really ironic and crazy. If religion requires, mass killing, then, I mean, so the juxtapositions, the artwork in the film, the imagery, it was just so, it was super high quality. So I encourage Molly, you to do more, keep going with great projects like that and the people you collaborated with.
That's
Thanks.
great, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
wonderful.
really
to hear.
great. Yeah. Before we go to Steve, I just wanted to mention that Liz has some more links in there in the chat. And Liz also sends out an email that has a link to a recording of the discussion and other information that might have come up during the discussion. I think it's really beneficial to get that next Monday or whenever it comes in. So Steve Moen, if you could unmute, please.
Well, I really was struck by the intergenerational depiction of these characters. I love the grandfather and his honesty. I mean, if any of us had been of mature age in 1948 and maybe had gotten out of Europe and ended up in Palestine, he summed it all up. We needed a Jewish state, and the fact that other people were there was just not very important. And he was convinced of the integrity of that outlook. And then his daughter, the mother, and she's still kind of institutional. She says, well, I'm glad you're thinking, my daughter, but can't you just do your service for 2 or 3 years and maybe you'll learn something and have a little more mature perspective? And the granddaughter is saying, well, look, you educated me. You taught me how to think, and now I'm thinking, and why are you mad at me? And this is so close to what happened in the United States during the Vietnam experience. It's so close. I think that people who couldn't understand why we wouldn't support our institutions, because anybody over 30 would support our institutions. That's what you're supposed to do. They got us out of the Depression and all blah, blah, blah. Well, these people are ordinary people. They're not inherently evil. And I love the way you made them a 3-generational family that struggled with such a significant issue. This is, to me, this is filmmaking at its best.
Yeah, that's great. When you did those interviews, did you, I mean, the scenes where the people are talking together, was there any kind of prompt of what they might discuss or thought like ahead of time? And did you set that up and did you film it more than once or,
Yeah, there's a variety of setups, some totally organic, some totally set up, but even in the setup ones, really there was very little prompting. It was like, why don't you talk about Atalia's decision-making process? And then they would just go. Like they did not need.
No, I felt like they'd maybe had these conversations before.
Yeah, some of Atalia's the scene with Atalia and her parents and her brother, that was like a 3-hour conversation that I filmed and condensed into 5 minutes. And of course they had variations of that conversation before. But the conversation with her grandfather and her uncle had never happened like that. Of course, like maybe at a dinner party, there would be a comment here or there, but she had never had a concentrated conversation about it with them, such as that. So it was interesting, to see how the documentary kind of facilitated that. And I think it was it was quite interesting for Atalia as well.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, the Burkhalters have their hand up. If you could unmute, please.
Yes, this is Sheldon speaking, and I'm sorry I'm not on live video here, but because it's not functioning. But I do want to comment about also what others have said. I was really moved by the Atalia's story and the unfolding of it. It was really incredible to see. It portrayed in a way that it was an unfolding experience for her. It was a first generational experience, and it was unfolding. It wasn't all, it appeared that it wasn't all settled before it started. And that also carried in the intergenerational features of it. One of the reasons I'm particularly impressed by it is I come from a tradition that my ancestors for over 400 years have proclaimed conscientious objection. I remember when I was an 18-year-old, I went and signed as a conscientious objector. And so did my father, and so did my other family members. But I have record of back in the Swiss 1600s, early 1600s, ancestors who had farms confiscated, who were imprisoned because of this stand in as conscientious objector, nonviolent commitment. But again, I just want to return to this aspect of the freshness of the portrayal today, and really admire the story of Atalia and her family's candor in that. So thank you very much, Molly.
Okay, Ruth has her hand up, her virtual hand up. If you could unmute, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I too really loved the family relationships and felt that was so strong, and felt that the relationship with the brother was really kind of wonderful. And she must have gained a lot of courage and had someone, leading some footsteps ahead of her, because he was an objector before she was, right? Yeah. And did you say that she had a younger sister that you knew in school?
No, I knew Amitai. I knew her brother from college.
Oh, her brother.
He did what I referred to earlier as gray refusal. So he found a route out through mental health exemption.
Okay. And is he here now, or is he?
He is in the U.S. now. Yeah, he's been back and forth for a while. Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask about the interview, leaving the military. How was that a setup? Because you must not have been able to do that, and it's such a strong scene.
Yeah, that was the only reenactment, and it was the only thing where we hired 3 actors to participate as the board, but it was based on, and the script was written condensed from a transcript of the actual hearing.
That's what I was wondering, whether it were the words that she came up with at the time, which it's so succinct and well distilled. Yeah, thank you.
And she was a pretty good actress too for that reenactment.
Yeah.
Not everybody can do that. That was pretty impressive. Okay, next we have, is it Christy? Go ahead, please unmute yourself. There you go.
One of the things I wanted to comment is similar to what others have said, but I was so touched in the film by the gift that Atalia had to listen deeply. I mean, she seemed to listen deeply to the Palestinians and their experience. She listened deeply to her mom and her dad, and to her uncle and grandfather. And that is just such a gift, but it speaks to us now. And some of what we need to all be able to do is listen deeply to people that we think we agree with, but also those that we don't agree with for a different, a deeper level of understanding. And gosh, Molly, I think you just portrayed that so beautifully in terms of the family dynamics. When our kids speak truth to us from their experience, it's not always easy as parents to take that in and listen deeply. And I thought that was so beautifully expressed, so that the mom not only listened deeply, but then was able to be transformed in ways that were really speak to us today in many levels. So I just thank you so much. Such a grateful heart for your work. And I agree, continue to make films because you are incredibly gifted. So grateful heart. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great thing to remember. Jerry, if you could unmute.
Hi. Okay, my quick thing, I want to say thank you to Asaf for being one of the most courageous young men I've ever met. And I've had a number of interactions with him over the years and know him to be brilliant and thoughtful and kind. And Asaf, I thank you for doing this because you have been teaching people in Seattle over all these years, and I'm really grateful to you. That's it.
Yeah, I'm pretty impressed how you can speak, Asaf. You get all the, you put all the words in all the right order. I'm really impressed. Thanks.
I'm blushing. I have to know that Jerry actually leads or has organized the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, and he's a huge organizer and mover in the community. I'm honored to have known you at least to the degree I did, and so happens that as a statistician at my work at Seattle Children's, one of the key articles that is cited everywhere is used. Jerry is a co-author, or I think maybe even the lead author on it, as a nurse researcher, I believe, or a public health researcher. So,
well, and as a little teaser, Jerry's going to be a guest of ours coming up in a few weeks at one of the next films. That's great. David Klein, could you unmute, please?
Yes. I just had a couple of brief comments. One is there is an absolutely stunning acting moment early on with one of the young Palestinian herders when he talks about what the soldiers have done and made it impossible for them to graze their flocks. And then there's a long moment, Molly, that you really hold where you can see the anguish in his face and his body. It's just incredible. And you of course have a taste to say, I'm going to hold this, and make sure that people see it. And he doesn't say anything, but it's just all there. It's absolutely fabulous. There were moments, there are several references to the Holocaust in this movie, and I had to relate it to last month's movie and the Palestinian doctor who said, look, we are not going to be able to have peace until the Israelis are able to come to terms with the Holocaust. What?
Call it back.
The Palestinian psychiatrist, I think. Well, who said that?
Yes, right.
I have that right? Yeah, that was in last month's movie, and I just, suddenly I flashed back on this, how that ties into it, and of course the cries of, when they're being attacked by counter demonstrators, go back to Berlin. What? Go back to Berlin? What are they dealing? And again, I think it's
the context there. Yeah, sorry to interject. The context there is that Berlin has become actually a pretty popular place for Israelis to move to in the last decade or so.
Okay.
I have a cousin and a niece in Berlin right now, so that's and it's more convenient there. The living is cheaper, and many people get German citizenship.
So that's not a Holocaust reference then?
No, but I mean it's an underhanded also. I mean backhanded in the sense. Okay, you're so stupid that you go even back to Berlin and forget what was done there. Maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
it is a thing right now. It's kind of trendy to be in Berlin, actually, especially, I say, people who are more left-leaning, even though that's not always the case.
Yeah. And the third thing I wanted to mention was that, this whole idea of going into the army, not going into the army, I'm born in 1945, so there I am in the late 50s, and it is just expected that you're going to go in the army. And I can remember talking with a friend, well, do we want to do this right after high school, get it over with? Do we want to wait until, we could go to college and wait till after then? What did we want to do? It was just expected. As you say, for Israelis, it's just expected. And then the Vietnam War changes that entirely. And one of the differences is you go into the army, you can go to Vietnam, you can get killed. Nobody expects to get killed in 1958 by going into the army in the US. And I wonder, for Israeli soldiers, not very many of them are expecting to go into the army and get killed. They may have to do some difficult things, but it's not nearly the same as Vietnam, where there was a real consequence to it. I don't know if you
That's a great
comment
point.
on that.
That's a great point, and I think that's one reason whenever there is a conflagration nowadays, it's more dangerous. The entire Israeli system does somersaults to close ranks, and you find no daylight between the far right and the most progressive Zionist parties. All of them support any war that will be, because they saw in Lebanon, like Molly mentioned before, Lebanon was, so there have always been some conscientious objection. There's always will be, like the Burkhardt family said very, very clearly before. I mean, Burkhalter, sorry. It's part. Some people have that more clear sense of conscience than others, and can live that walk anytime. But more generally, it's at times when there's danger, like you're saying, it's more obvious, and also when there's schism in this society. So in Israel, the breakout of a public refusal movement was the Lebanon War in 1982, the first invasion of Lebanon. And the movement that rose from that was called the Yesh Gvul, and it actually still active as well in supporting refusers of all stripes. So there are a few groups out there. And they were more effective because half the country was against the war, and the political system was more split. Again, it wasn't like, people were rewriting the history and saying that, half the people, the politicians did not vote. I mean, most of the politicians were initially in support because they were afraid, but their public was against it, and eventually they turned against it, and it became a division in Israeli society, or deepened divisions that were already there, and that's why the Lebanon War, they had to backtrack more quickly, and they had to stop. And then the refusers had more of a public impact because of that. So and that's why the most recent conflagrations, whether it was Lebanon or Gaza, there was extra effort made to hold everybody in line. The entire the media, except the usual suspect, the few radicals in the media, you can hear them, but they say the same thing anyway. But everybody else, the entire media is wall-to-wall propaganda supporting any war when it happens. And that makes it much harder for these people to go out and refuse. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Ruth has her hand up again.
Well, I was wondering, when Asaf, when you say that, do you include Haaretz?
Oh, yes. I include Haaretz. Haaretz plays a very delicate dance. On one hand, it's definitely the home newspaper of some of the most vocal and consistent anti-occupation journalists, including investigative journalists. On the other hand, it always ends up hemming and hawing and still supporting whatever happens. Again, in real time, when it really counts, and they, by the way, when we came out, again, they're hedging. So when we came out, the 2002 Courage to Refuse, our first ad. So the way we came out is put an ad in the Friday newspaper, which is the most, it's like the week, it's like the Sunday paper in the US. We put up an ad, we paid for it, but it was, the first ad was in Haaretz, and Haaretz gave us a discount. However, as the numbers grew and grew and grew, they ended up putting out an editorial against refusal. It was like, so we came out in late January. In March, some point in March, when it was in real time, you know, when really every movement of the needle mattered, both in what actually the government did and in how many people would support us and how many people would join us. They put out an editorial against refusal. And we heard behind the scenes, because we heard behind the scenes that the vote in the editorial committee was split along gender lines. So generally, most of the men were for, and most of the women were, most of the women were supporting refusal, and most of the men were against the refusal.
Interesting. Wow, that's interesting. I have another part of my question, if I can ask it. Do you think that with Amnesty International coming out and calling it apartheid, and B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, and increasingly international organizations and human rights organizations are being heard, do you see any change being brought about by that, or is it too soon?
Thank you for asking. First of all, it's good that they do that. One huge problem with Israel-Palestine and the occupation in particular is the euphemism, the dancing around the issue, the mincing of words, particularly in the English language press and public discourse, the US, the UK, the rest of the English-speaking West. A lot of euphemisms dancing around the issue. So it's good to not mince words. We're seeing the impact of that in Ukraine. When you call a spade, it's easier to organize and get broad support for things that are needed to be done. So in that sense, civil society in form of these NGOs moving towards that, starting to set the stage. It will not affect Israeli public opinion so much unless it comes along with tangible steps that, again, put a price on occupation. But hopefully it provides backing for more and more bodies in the civil society and in the political systems of the world to take such steps.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dave, if you could unmute.
Yeah, hi. This question for Asaf, I think, is could you explain what I experienced when one of my daughter's classmates in the Seattle area here in high school, so around age 17 or maybe 18, she was so excited to have, I guess, like an open invitation. She's a US citizen here, obviously, so her whole family, but she was Jewish, and she had this open invitation to join the IDF and serve, and probably comes with other benefits. And I know, like, the ultra-Orthodox community that I had a chance to work with 1 year, not too long ago, they would tell me how they're offered like $200,000 and I think a house in a settlement to go move from here, and like, so there's active like benefits being offered to Jewish people in the US. And so, but I still don't understand exactly what that young woman was being offered and how she got to serve in the IDF from here. And then she came back here, but she loved posting selfies with, and Molly, you showed this in your film, you know, the young women in uniform and they're holding their guns. They had their cameras up. They loved doing that. It was a thing. And I was disgusted at the time to see her. I think she got an article in the school newspaper with her and her new guy friends in the IDF, and she was holding a weapon, and it was like all so glorious. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, how is it that? So my question is, what is that process that IDF can attract American Jews to keep that propaganda and war machine going that way?
Maybe if Molly has, maybe you have some personal acquaintances who've gone through that. I would defer to you. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, first I'll just say that this is one of the reasons it's so important that SF is raising young Jewish activists to counter this narrative. And yeah, there's luckily the US has seen more youth activism in addition to Jewish Voice for Peace, which does amazing work, but also tends to the older generations. There's also, if not now, that is mostly youth that have been running campaigns against particularly targeting Birthright and similar organizations. And I think that's really important to be introducing introducing ideas counter to what are dominant in a lot of Jewish day schools and synagogues here. So I think that's really where the change from what you're describing is going to come from young American Jews organizing to put out a different narrative. And yeah, I think if not now, has also moved from in terms of their outward political rhetoric, moved from what was more of a trying to toe the line and not alienate people who are afraid to call a spade and call the occupation an occupation, to now being very vocal and also referring to the situation as apartheid. So that's also a positive sign.
Yeah, thank you. I should maybe add also, yeah, Molly described the counter movements that's starting to provide a different narrative, but as she said, the Jewish community in the US as well, much of it, the establishment part of it for sure, raise youngsters to see Israel in a very favorable light, and also it's part of the Jewish, it's become part of the Jewish American identity in many communities to be connected to Israel, for obvious reasons, and you know, Jewish communities have been amazing, have done amazing contributions to American society, and we are, you know, I am Jewish, of course, too, a minority, and we've seen that anti-Semitism is alive as well. So there's a lot of fear involved and a lot of trepidation. But I think non-Jewish allies of American Jews can respectfully disagree and understand that on Israel, most of these establishment Jewish movements are just wrong. They're not unable to see, they're afraid to see the reality. And that's how you get 16, 17 years old so excited to go, and how you get the whole birthright. So yeah, the hardcore, I think people like the friend of your daughter that you mentioned are not so common. But birthright is really insidious. I mean, you get this free trip for 10 days or 2 weeks to Israel, and it's like, you know, one big it's spring break. It's, you know, it's Jewish spring break. That's what it is. It's instead of going to Florida, you go to Israel, and Israel has become a party country, you know, in many ways. I mean, Israelis, you know, how to have a good time. Very, you know, very fresh and attractive young generation, and they mingle, and you know, it was even explicitly said by some of the people running the birthright. It's all about, you know, getting them to hang out and, you know, maybe have a crush on some Israeli kid when they're there, and vice versa. And yeah, and my wife had you know, she was, as a soldier, was appointed to accompany one birthright trip, and she ended up having a relationship with one of the people there for a couple of years after that. So you know, and then you have this visceral connection that it's hard to break, and you know, it's it's all subsidized because they feel it's such an important thing. And again, maintaining that external support for the occupation, because if the West stops supporting Israel on the occupation cannot hold up on its own. Even though Israel is stronger than Palestinians, the numbers at some point won't add up. Whatever numbers they are, they would stop adding up if Israel had to pay a civil price for the occupation.
Asaf and Molly, thank you.
Lynn's had her hand up, her virtual hand up for quite a while. So Lynn in Boulder.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you saw my hand because my daughter's fish has yellow on it too. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I don't, at the risk of going off topic, I want to say that to me, Israel is a metaphor for what's going on with Ukraine and the rest of the world that's now come to a point of real criticality, at least, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I have been struggling to figure out where Israel is, because, and maybe someone here knows, maybe SF knows, maybe Molly knows, but they did not step in when it came to the UN resolution against the quote unquote war against the Russians. And I know there was some Russian connection between Israel and Russia. And then I know also that Russia was opposing Assad, was supporting Assad, and Israel is against Assad. So maybe there's that overpowering Israel. I'm just desperately trying to figure out how we can avoid going up in a mushroom cloud, because I don't think that we're very far from, I think many of us feel that we're not very far from it when all this poking of Putin now with his nuclear capability. This hasn't happened before. And of course, Israel has nuclear capability and the US does. And if China doesn't step in, there's all these dynamics, and so that we can have more of these wonderful forms you put on with this fabulous filmmaker, and not just be disappearing as a result of the atom bomb. I ask my question.
Thanks, Lynn. I think you're not the only one that's not sleeping these days.
Yeah, everyone's late on their taxes because of this too.
Yeah. So Molly's going to have to leave us soon. And but if you could just, we can wrap this up. If you could just wrap it up a little bit, Molly, that'd be great. And then we can say thanks to you and Asaf.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting me. I guess I'll leave that very large and important question from Lynn for all of us to consider. I'm sorry I don't have more time tonight, but it was really wonderful to hear all of your reflections on the film. It means a lot to me, and wonderful to hear Asaf's perspective. I'm really glad that you and your kids are here doing the important work to do what we all want to do, I think. And I just extend my solidarity up north to you all. So I hope you'll spread the word about the film to anyone who you think might be affected. And if you can check out that page on our website with the links to many organizations worthy of support, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
And it's also only $1.99 on Amazon. So it's really easy to get to see.
Oh,
thanks, Molly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Molly.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for this amazing movie.
Hey, Asaf, is there anything that you want to leave us with? Something optimistic?
Something optimistic. Again, I think the young generation is much better than us. So that's something to be optimistic about. I think, again, going back to that grandfather, which who really, again, spoke straight to the camera without any trepidation, and he made the connection, the Holocaust connection. He said, there was a Holocaust. That's why we're entitled to take this country and kick the Arabs out. He said it outright, and he gave the game away. I mean, very few Israelis say it so bluntly, but it is, because of the Holocaust, the world dances around Israel, the West in particular, dances around Israel and gives it a lot of a free pass. Because of the Holocaust, Palestinians have been erased from a narrative and consciousness for and claw their way back in, and it's time. It's not helping anybody. This dancing around. It's not helping Israel either, because Israel is a dark path, which enjoy that either. But again, they're afraid of the alternative. It's a comfort, but it's a sick comfort. That is, Israelis. It's like you're doing something that it's wrong, just like being addicted to a drug or something. It's wrong, but you can't stop. It's the world to help it. So. And again, in the audience, I know there's a much bigger organizers than me in this audience. So what can be done, or you can look up again to the young generation and the actions they're leading, because they're innovative and again less afraid than we are, and just support that and engage in that, and find ways to help Palestinians gain their rights and their freedom, and help Israelis get out of this addiction.
Thank you. Thank you. Well said.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Asaf, and thanks everybody for tuning in. I wanted to turn it over to Ruth to wrap it up, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about the next movie in a couple weeks.
Yes, I'm really excited about our next film. We have not only do we have the film Gaza, but we get to have Jerry Haynes back with us. She will be our guest. And we're really thrilled and delighted that she's able to be with us, because she really knows the territory. And so we look forward to having you all back and seeing Gaza when it screens, and being with us for the discussion. And Jerry, do you have anything you'd like to add? I think she's with us this evening. Maybe she's gone.
She was definitely here earlier. She might have signed off by now.
Yeah, she may have. But anyway, it's going to be a kind of a stunning film again, and about a really heartbreaking disaster, but the one that most Americans don't know.
And it's a really, really beautiful film, which is kind of unnerving.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks
Have a
so
great
much.
weekend.